Network Automation Nerds podcast. Hello and welcome to Network Automation Nerds podcast, a podcast about network automation, network engineering, Python, and other technology topics. I'm your host, Eric Cho. Today on the show, we'll be talking to Andy Champagne, SVP and CTO at Akamai Labs. Andy has been in the industry since the early 1990s. The early work focused on network engineering and architecture for regional ISPs. Since joining Akamai in the 2000s, Andy has held a variety of engineering and leadership roles. In part one of this episode, we talked to Andy about his origin story, how he got into network engineering, and some of his value leadership principles. Let's dive right in. Welcome.
All right, awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm flattered to be here.
Yeah. So, Andy, before we talk about your experience at Akamai and your leadership roles, your leadership philosophies, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you get into technology? Your origin story?
Yeah, the origin story. Ooh, that's always a dangerous one. But I was one of those kids, and I kind of grew up in an interesting time, right? Like the '80s, which was such a transition period from really vacuum tubes were on the way out, and microprocessors and such were on the way in, and transistors were on the way in, and so I spent a ton of my youth really working with my grandparents, right? One of whom was a machinist. So
Mhm.
like a big appreciation for precision and like craftsmanship. And then my other grandfather who was like into like electronics repair.
Mm.
And so, I spent my formative years, kind of working with old technology for play, right? Like, putting together Heath kits and like, building multimeters and the kind of stuff that, you get that today, like it's bad,
Yeah.
but it was that
Yeah.
like vintage experience of, like dealing with vacuum tubes and Heath kits and soldering stuff. So, I grew up with really just an affinity for electronics. And that's really where it started for me.
Mhm.
And subsequently, obviously computers became a bigger and bigger thing.
Right.
And when I found out about the internet, right, it was just like, oh my gosh. And it's like it takes this relevancy that used to be a single thing that you had, like an electronic circuit, and it just abstracted it to a worldwide layer. So that's dense, and like let's jump into that, and happy to unpack more of that. But for me, it was I was the kid who took apart the VCR and then put it back together, and kind of those things built rockets and that kind of stuff. So I've just always been fascinated with technology, and more specifically like how things work and then
Yeah.
how you can make them better.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I remember I wasn't one of those kids. Right? Like, I'm always afraid to break things, and therefore I didn't have the exposure. I'll tell you a story, right? Like when I was in college, you know how easy it is to change RAMs in computers. It basically is just like a 30-second thing. But I was so afraid of breaking it because I was sharing a computer with my sister. So I went to Best Buy, and then the guy was busy, but I needed to have it done. So I was like walking around, waited for like an hour for them to do like a 30-second thing. But luckily, I asked the guy, say, hey, if can I just observe how you do it, this black magic of upgrading my RAM? And he's like, yeah, no problem. So I just saw it, and I saw how easy it was. And then I realized that exposure is really like a key to a lot of our knowledge, right? You can't be afraid to break things in order to understand them, and that's a luxury a lot of people don't have. It's just like the ability to break things and not get blamed for it. So I'm super happy to see that you had that exposure in such a young age.
That's awesome. And to be clear, like I would get like a TV would come in, or my grandfather had some electronics that he was repairing, and it would be unsavable. And then I would get all the boards out of that, right? And all the boards out of
Yeah.
that had umpteen great components on them. So, many a capacitor was exploded, resistors, just so it was, I had a really good flow of what I would, is largely considered junk or e-waste today. But back then it was just like, hey, here, play with this.
Yeah.
And so, yes. And to your point about DIMMs, or anything like that, or even processor like insertion slots, like the first time doing that is terrifying because you have to
Hmm.
push it so hard that it almost breaks. You feel like
Right.
it's going to break, and then it
Right.
doesn't. And that's just like you have to get the confidence in the engineering of, oh, it's built to do this, and I can take it out and put it back in, and it's all good. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think more and more guardrails were built in. So like the little click sound or the kind of force that you can't really describe until you experience it. But yeah, I think just it's just the exposure, right? Like people need to tinker around with stuff. And that is why for my daughters, I give them these kits that are easy to tinker with. And I don't know if you heard of little bits, but those are like little servos, little and you don't need to solder them. You just kind of magnetically attach them together. And it's just pretty awesome.
Yeah, so relevancy there. So I have an 8-year-old daughter too, and we have these. They're called snap circuits, which is like a
Yeah.
similar thing, and they like pop
Yeah.
together.
Yeah.
So we're all about that, and she has done. We've done some soldering projects as well because that's important to learn. But yeah, no, a general theme that I think is super important to me, and that if I'm not playing, I'm not happy.
Yeah.
And whatever I'm working on, and it is imperative to me that it's fun and that it's interesting. And you're not always going to get that 100% of the time, but for
Right.
me, like, my balance is saying, hey, am I having fun? Am I learning something new? And am I playing with the technology or with something? Because that's when you end up being able to do something interesting, right? Like if you sit
Right.
down and try to just say, okay, I'm going to think really hard, that doesn't work. You have to experiment, try things, whether it's software, hardware. Playing with it is, setting up a lab for yourself if you can, and having, whether it's routers to work with or software, virtual machines, whatever, containers. Just playing with technology is the pathway forward. And frankly, like 98% of my technology learning comes from play.
I think you drive a good point about technology and playing, and I imagine that's kind of what you do at. I mean, just from the surface on Akamai Labs, right? Because it has the labs in it, and inherently you think of research, development, and just playing around with different technology. Is that the correct presumption?
I wish I could say yes, and I think there's a large aspect of that, right? Which a big part of my role at Akamai is to play with things and try to figure out where we should go
Right.
from a high level strategic direction, and working with Bobby, my boss, our CTO, and Tom, our CEO, and our different kind of executives on where we want to go. But there's a lot of corporate, right? And that's not a bad thing. It's just we're a big company, 10,000 odd people roughly. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of process in corporate, but I think what I really enjoy about my role, and where I think I bring some differentiation in, is that notion of play. And I'm serious, but I also think it's like, well, we're doing this because we're having fun, right? We're not doing this because this is like, we're doing this because it's fun and interesting, and we're building something kind of net new, and we're
Hmm.
doing something in a unique way. So yeah, it's not all kind of coasting around on segues, like looking at interesting, like we're dealing with projects, we're dealing with timelines, but we're also dealing with a company that has grown. We're coming up on our 25-year anniversary, so the company is going to be 25 years old, from zero to three and a half ish $1 billion of revenue. And,
Wow.
and it's been an amazing story. So yeah, so it's not all play, it's not all fun, but that keeping that element of play is what makes it, I think, workable and fun and engaging over the long term.
How do you find the balance though? Because I am actually in research and development as well at A10 in my day job, and it's always kind of difficult to find the balance really because you're essentially a cost center and you're trying to find that direct link between the results into customer signing a PO, so you can like kind of justify your existence. But how do you find the balance, Andy?
So I think there's always a tension there. Right.
Yeah.
I haven't talked to anybody, as I talk to peers or folks at different organizations. I haven't found anybody who's got it all licked. And I think, one of the challenges is companies love to do a global prioritization,
Hmm.
meaning saying, hey, and this isn't an Akamai comment, it's generally, hey, say for, we
Sure.
have the following 5 top priorities. And I think that you have to actually think in multiple categories, which is we're going to have product priorities. We're going to have optimization priorities, and we're going to have R&D priorities. And listen, I mean, if R&D is inexorably linked to selling something like near
Hmm.
term, that's probably not going to set R&D up for a lot of success because you're beholden to a customer feature.
Right.
So, a little bit of that is, and to be clear, I've done both tactical R&D, like, hey, we've got to, invent something that is going to be appealing to this specific need or this opportunity. And we've
Right.
also done more like blue sky R&D, like, hey, what about this area? And
Hmm.
like investigating that. And I think it's important to figure out like what mode the team is in. And
Yeah.
then ensuring that the people around you are aligned and motivated, and everybody's okay with that, because it's not
Right.
like the same kind of people all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I like that because like you said, we're not designing the feature by committee, right? Like if if that's the case, that we just end up in that famous quote where we just end up with faster horse, right? So no, I like that. I like that. I think what you said about it's kind of like a method, right? Like you start with categorizing whether it's a moonshot or versus it's just a feature that's needed by X amount of date and asked by a customer versus, and then that just generally from there that we kind of move forward with.
Absolutely. And, I think one of the important things about technology management is creating space for that play, right? Which is
Hmm.
if it's all applied, you're going to get a good result on the applied, but you're kind of shortchanging your future. And you've got to think about how do we play so that we kind of invent the future. And that's, listen, I mean, that's part of what's been awesome over the last 20 odd years.
Yeah, so I want to dive that into a little bit when you talk about that's part of the technology management and leadership. So, w- can you just tell me a little bit about what does that mean to you, like leadership and technology management, or even R&D?
Yeah. So I would say I am an atypical, like atypical manager, right? Which is
Okay.
I am very much not a micromanager. I'm very much about, we're all on adult in air quote rules, which
Yeah.
is I'm expecting folks to put in really good effort, but I'm really here to help my team. And I look at this like this: these aren't the people that work for me; these are the people that work with me, right? And
Hmm.
my job, is sometimes coach, sometimes architect, technology reviewer, sometimes like therapist with workplace disputes and all this kind of stuff. But ultimately, the goal is to enable people, and finding the real challenge is finding the right people and getting
Hmm.
people who are passionate about what we're working on, because I
Yeah.
think the result is, we need people who want more than a job, right? In
Yeah. Yeah.
technology, you have to bring an external passion into the role to
Yeah.
really be successful. And I think that's, frankly, once you find a team of, A players who has that similar alignment, the rest is kind of goes on its own.
I like that. So I'm my apology because I just we kind of let this conversation into kind of naturally flow, but I realized that people might not know what Akamai does because a lot of times it's behind the scenes, right? Although I think most of our audience is network engineer, networking background, so they may know. But in just brief overview, can you tell us what does Akamai do, and
Yeah,
what
sure.
are their strengths?
Yeah, sure. So Akamai is effectively today a global cloud and cloud security company.
Okay.
So we operate a very large distributed network. So we have on the order of 350,000 servers that are deployed around the world in thousands of different locations.
Right.
And we run a software stack on these servers that provides essentially an assortment of SaaS services to our customers.
Hmm.
Some of those services are distributed security services, so web application firewall type services, where we're effectively front ending your website and filtering for threats that are inbound and ensuring that the bad folks don't get through.
Yeah.
We have and kind of classically what we're known for is our content delivery business,
Right.
where we are delivering content out to end users. And the core premise of Akamai, which was really the precipice for Akamai's invention back in the late '90s, was this notion that the internet needed to be distributed, and if you
Right.
tried to serve content from one spot, it wasn't really working well. And in the late '90s, big websites of the time had huge scaling challenges, and they were trying to buy bigger and bigger servers. And Dr. Tom Layton, our co-founder, really had this invention, which was, hey, we're going to take it and smash it into 1,000 pieces and distribute it, and we're going to
Right.
map users so that when I'm in Massachusetts and I'm going to an asset, I'm going to get directed to an Akamai server that is very close to me, and I'm going to
Yeah.
get the content from there. So that the CDN business is kind of what we're known for. And then most recently, a little bit under a year now, we acquired Linode, which is a cloud computing provider. So we also have compute in our portfolio now. And there's a lot more to that. I could talk about Akamai and kind of what it is for probably more than an hour, but it's an amazing company. We're headquartered here in Massachusetts, and we're just about at our 25th year anniversary.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, so for me, I was one of the original team members to launch CloudFront for AWS. So, I mean, back then, Akamai still is the dominant player in CDN, right? But we were very aware of, the presence of Akamai and Limelights and a few other major players around the globe that does CDN. But I think you're right about. Akamai branching out, and the premise is not just CDN, right? Like CDN is kind of one of the application of that ideology of smashing the internet into different pieces that are closer to the user so you could serve them better.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we started out with in the very late '90s, and back then, our competitors were boxes. It
Yeah.
was ink to me, and these, we were literally competing with people selling caching boxes that you would take and put into your data
Yes,
centers,
I remember
and
that.
yeah, and we were a service, and this was before people sold services, so we would go in to
Right.
sell something, and we were actually displacing a hardware purchase where folks were going to buy more iron and put it in an Exodus data center at the time, or whatever,
Right.
and we had a service based approach, and to kind of resonate with the network geek side. So I stuck because I'm supposed to be this is supposed to be my origin story, so I'll back into that a little more. Just
Sure.
so my background prior to Akamai is I was in the ISP space, and I
Oh,
was
nice.
essentially, yeah, network engineering.
Right.
So I cut my teeth in the mid '90s, essentially, running backbones for what I'd say is regional internet service providers. Back then, the ISP landscape was much more diverse. You had a
Right.
lot of kind of local ISPs. Most access was dial-up. Businesses had T1s, or maybe a fractional T3. Many of your viewers and listeners probably don't even know what those things are, but essentially like old, like, private line facilities that would be
I
run
do.
from your
For the record, I do.
Thank you. That's good. No, and listen, so like I literally cut my teeth like configuring Cisco 2501s and VXRs and kind of things of that era, running an ISP, and Akamai, which was just this amazing thing, because from a network perspective, so many of the things that you were fighting with around traffic engineering and around making efficient use of capacity and trying to improve user performance, which we would, in the network side, you try to do, okay, we need more peering, and we need to have better, we need to be better peered, we
Yeah.
need a better upstream, we need to multi-home, and all these different solutions. Akamai had this approach, which now looking back on it was like the SDN version, where it's like, well,
Mhm.
it's not just a network, it's actually software. So, I ended up through the ISP community joining Akamai on the network side. So I started
Mhm.
on the network side at Akamai, and that was just an awesome experience, and just such a fun move to make, and such a great opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I joined the network community probably around the same time as you, Andy, because my first installation was go out to the site and install DSLs, right? Like, remember, we're local ISP reselling DSLs and so on and so forth. And back to what you were talking about, like it doesn't work. You're absolutely right, right? Like, I was building out the regional network for Roadrunner, which is cable modems. So one of the first question we did was capacity planning, and essentially we're playing with the Mother's Day issue, right? Like, the biggest day of the peak, we're banking on people smoothing out our curve as far as usage. And if everybody starts to use it at the max capacity, like streaming a movie, then we will come into we're becoming there'll be a problem with the bandwidth consumptions, and that's where the CDNs comes in, and from the network side, as you alluded to, that could smooth out that curve for us because it's locally originated. You just have to fetch the origin the first time.
Yeah, exactly. And you're shifting the bottleneck from what used to be a transit bottleneck, right? Which is, how
Right.
do I get out to bring those content in? And you had this terrible multiplication issue, which is, if there's actually a live event that that the majority of my subscribers wanted to watch, my
Right.
network's going to collapse. And Akamai and other, obviously with other technology as well, shifted that by saying, hey, we're going to pull the content in once, and then we're going to
Right.
replicate it out inside the network, where you're dealing with, at the time it might have been token ring, or maybe fast Ethernet, but you'd be dealing with other topologies that have a lot more headroom at the time than you might have on your T3 or OC3 backbone link, whatever you had at the time.
Yeah. So I watched Thursday Night Football last night, and I'm still amazed that, like you said, right? It's not something you could readily cache ahead of time, but you have to do that real time buffering, and calculate those bandwidth. So obviously, Andy, you had a lot of background in network engineering, just regional ISPs into kind of distributed network and having a software play. And this was before Salesforce, right? Like, so people are not used to having subscription based service. They're used to just buying big boxes, like I forget what those called. Like, are they called like bandwidth optimizer or like you know?
Yeah, like there's those, like basically it was like, they were caching type boxes, like a squid type function. I know what you're talking. I can't remember the name because there was a cache flow and there's a bunch of
Yeah,
different. Yeah,
and also like compressing your TCP. And then they start playing with some weird stuff, right? Like they start like saying, "Hey, do we really need this header?" But maybe not, right? Like maybe we just have like an extension, so we go from like 16 bits to 4 bits, and that just becomes so weird and proprietary that you have to sandwich between them, and it just becomes such a nightmare to troubleshoot because they're doing some proprietary technology stuff, and so it's non-standard, and that ultimately proved that it doesn't work, right? You have to play nice with each other, or people might disagree, but that's my
yeah,
opinion,
no,
anyways.
transparent proxies. So just to be clear, I mean, I ran in the ISP regime. I ran transparent proxies at the time,
Right.
and it's just a nightmare because it's this box which has its own interpretation of how the standard should work, and you would find all these random applications that it would break. Outside of corporate environments, those aren't really a thing today, right? Today, you've got
Yeah.
like SWGs in the corporate environment, which is kind of analogous to it. But outside of that, I mean, that's not really something that you see a lot of today, because it's just, I think it gets in the way. And if you think about like the protocol complexity behind Chrome, right, and what is it actually talking? Is it quick, and is it HTTPS, and how's it working? And I mean, essentially today everything's encrypted, right? So there's a whole other issue there where that kind of topology is not as effective today.
Yeah. So I want to kind of dive into what you were talking about, because obviously you were very engineering centric, very deep technology background, but then you made the transition into management, being a leader, leading different types of groups. So how many, for people who are interested in doing the same, maybe they're at thinking about going to management, or they're thinking about being a lead in, the technical or project lead. What are some of the transition you have done, and what kind of advices can you give them?
Awesome question. So I think the first one is, to me, that first jump that I remember is when you become a team lead, right? Which is
Right,
you
right.
kind of have that quasi management responsibility,
Mhm.
and that is, I think, probably one of the most important inflection points. And I think there's a second one that I'll probably talk about as well. But that notion that your work is not just about you anymore, and your work is about conducting the work of others. And frankly,
Yeah,
you got to figure out if you want to do that, because it's a
yeah,
choice that you're making to say that your technical, like, you're not coming up with the answer, you're supporting other people to come up with the answer. And that's
right,
like that, not everybody wants to do that, and that's fine. And that you can blend it, and obviously you put input in, etc. But your job essentially transfers to empowering others instead of empowering yourself, right? And you have to look at
right,
like your success is less and less about you and more and more about your team. And
right.
I think it's a great, that was honestly like one of the most fun positions, because team lead is like you can get your feet wet, you can try it out, but you're not, you don't have quite all the responsibility, right?
You're not
um
writing performance reviews, or you're not,
exactly,
setting
right, which is,
KPIs for the quarter.
I mean, they're important, but they don't count as fun, right? They don't count as
Right.
play. That's kind of the
Yeah.
bureaucratic side of running a business or running an organization. It's exceptionally important, but it also kind of has that killing your soul feeling.
Yeah. Yeah, so
Uh,
you go ahead.
I was going to say the second one, I think, is when if you like being a team lead and you move up, and eventually you're a manager, and then maybe you're a senior manager, and then I'm going by like Akamai's like chart, then you'd go to like director. And
Yeah.
when you go from manager or senior manager to director, I think that's the next most important one. And the rationale is you no longer personally know everyone in your team. Like when you're a
Mm,
team lead, you have a club. You might have
right,
5, 6, 7 people. You know everybody. If you're in an office environment, you're all sitting around one area. If you're remote, you're all in the same Slack space, and you can just chat back and forth. You know everybody. You know kind of you know how to not offend everybody personally. Like you have a person, no, but you know, like, well, you know, I want to be, here's the kind of things I probably want to focus on. And you have like that personal kind of connection with everybody. When you go to director or something, and you might have like, let's say you have like 50 people, 75
Yeah.
people, you
Yeah.
lose that ability to say, I know everyone and I know how everyone will react to what I'm going to say. So
Hmm.
you then have to like check yourself a lot more. And it doesn't mean, you know, first of all, my number one feedback is always be authentic. You cannot pretend to be someone else. It will kill you on the inside. So you have
Yeah.
to be yourself. But is when you have that, you also just have to be cognizant that I don't know all these people like personally anymore. I don't just have one Slack space where I can chat with everybody, and more people are going to want to meet with me, and we're going to need to talk about how do we progress people through the organization. So those are the 2 points that I think, you know, get really interesting, which is team lead, and then when you get to director. And you know, for me, both of those roles were like super fun. But honestly, I'm lucky because we had just great people at Akamai, so it's just like an awesome canvas to work with.
Yeah, I'm interested in hearing about. I'm kind of personally in that same. I'm kind of in the first group that you were talking about, where kind of a driving the team lead position, driving some of the initiatives, and but I don't have to write the KPIs and the business the reviews, personal reviews. But I haven't gotten into the director level where I don't have a personal touch. Like it's almost like you lose the pulse of the business, as you were saying, if I get it correct. So what are some of the things that help you in making that transition? I think that's a big jump, isn't it? Like what you were saying, you start not personally knowing all of your team members.
Yeah, I think it is a big jump, but I would follow with management. It is just like software, which is an abstraction layer. And you have to be comfortable with your abstraction layer. And so when you get to director, senior director, vice president, all of a sudden, like the critical thing is who are the team leads?
Yeah.
How do you get to the point where you have when you are a team lead, you intimately know everybody in your group and you have kind of
Yes.
that personal connection with them. When you are a director, you need to have that same relationship with your managers. And
Hmm.
you really want to make sure that like your managers are culturally like that everybody's getting the same message about the company. Like you don't want to create like 2 or 3 versions of the company. You want to make everybody's got to be going in the same direction with kind of the same vision for where it's going to go, and what you're building from a technology stack. And candidly, you got to meet with people a lot, right? And like you got to do a lot of one-on-ones. And the other thing is like I love like town hall Q&A meetings, which
Mm.
is and it's one of the reasons I like podcasts. It's like there's nothing easier for me than I'm going to sit down and we're going to talk about whatever you questions for an hour. And you
Hmm.
ask me the tough ones. Ask me why raises are only X% instead of Y%. Like, and I'm going to give you the best answer I can. You're not always going to like it, and
Yeah.
just be authentic and just allow people access. Don't you can't. I'm a little bit of an introvert, right? I'll say that, which is like it is my general tendency is I want to be left to work alone. However, when I find myself with a group of people who love technology and are passionate about where we're going, I really feel differently. And it's like, then it's like, hey, let's talk about it. What are you having for problems with your project? Help me to understand why you're behind in this, march towards production that you're going down. And how can I help with that? And where do we go? Do we need more resources? So, you've got to be one of those people where I think you're energized about the technology. And I think it's okay if you're kind of more on the introvert side, but you have to be really passionate about tech, and you have to be able to translate that to being passionate about talking with people. And, especially today, Akamai prior to COVID was vastly mostly in person.
Hmm.
Now we're vastly mostly remote and
Mm.
kind of hybrid. And we've stayed in that model. And, the communication is still as important, if not more, because you have to get in front of people regularly. So, today I have a luxury where my direct team is small, but like the matrix team that I work out with in the company is just, we got 10,000 people in the company. So it's a lot of folks. And, I spend so much of my day is just chatting with folks on, our internal chat stuff. Email is probably the worst mechanism, right? At this point I'm just saying for like communication.
Yeah.
And, a lot of it is that like, hey, I'm just chatting with somebody while I'm doing a walk with an AirPod, and just you've got to be really willing to put the effort in around communication.
All right, that was part one of our conversation. I hope that was useful. Don't forget to tune in next week for part two, where we talk more about leading with authenticity and also the direction of network connectivity in the future. See you then. Thank you for listening to Network Automation Nerds podcast. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and all the other major podcast platforms. Until next time, bye-bye.